From drug trafficking to power. How Trump uses drug trafficking accusations to justify military action. Have you ever noticed how, in politics, nothing is said by chance? When Trump started talking about drug trafficking, many people thought he was just reinforcing the old American anti-drug rhetoric. But what few realized is that behind every word lay a carefully crafted power play. He wasn't just fighting crime, he was drawing a new map of global influence. And most impressively, he did it without firing a single shot. At least, not in the way the world expected. The curious thing is that the more he talked about drug traffickers, the more his authority grew. It was as if each accusation were a piece of a larger geopolitical puzzle, where the real enemy lay not in the back alleys of Latin America, but in the decision-making chambers of rival powers. Trump used fear and morality as political weapons. He transformed the rhetoric of good versus evil into a smokescreen that hid alliances, treaties, and behind-the-scenes moves. And the public, mesmerized by the spectacle, applauded the hero as he redrew the chessboard of power. But the big question is, how far will this game go? When the fight against trafficking becomes the pretext for new wars, who is really being protected? This is the story few dare tell. The story of how a well-constructed narrative can move armies, manipulate nations, and rewrite the future of global politics. For decades, the United States has built a powerful image of the invisible enemy, the one who threatens the nation's security, youth, and values. Anti-drug rhetoric became a moral shield, used by various administrations to justify actions that, in practice, went far beyond the fight against drugs. Trump, with his skill at transforming fear into political leverage, vigorously revived this narrative. He understood that when a nation is afraid, it accepts any promise of protection, and those who offer that protection gain power. In his speech, drug trafficking ceased to be merely a border issue and became a matter of sovereignty. It was a war against evil disguised as security policy. And like any good strategist, Trump realized that the invisible enemy is the most effective of all, because no one can prove where it begins or ends. Thus, every military operation, every containment measure seemed like a heroic act. It was the old tactic of transforming threat into opportunity, a lesson that, historically, has always favored those who knew how to control the narrative. This symbolic construction didn't emerge out of nowhere. It was honed over decades of films, headlines, and political campaigns that portrayed the drug trafficker as the ultimate villain. By bringing back this rhetoric, Trump not only reactivated collective memories of fear, but also positioned the United States as the savior in a corrupt world. It's curious how the psychology of fear drives entire societies. The more fear one feels, the more power one surrenders. And it's precisely at this point that the political game begins to intensify. The blame game, turning trafficking into justification for military power. When Trump began using drug trafficking as an excuse to deploy military forces, the geopolitical landscape changed. Suddenly, the fight against drugs ceased to be a police matter and became a matter of national defense. He accused entire countries of collusion with drug trafficking, paving the way for interventions, under the guise of protecting the American people. This narrative, while seemingly patriotic, concealed a strategic move, transforming other people's guilt into fuel for his own power. This is how the rhetoric against cartels and permeable borders became a quasi-moral justification for deploying troops and authorizing operations. Trump knew that fear mobilizes, but guilt unites. By pointing the finger outward, he reinforced the idea that the danger came from afar, and therefore any military action was legitimate. It was a game of mirrors. While the visible enemy was the foreign drug trafficker, the real objective was to consolidate domestic authority and global influence. This type of maneuver is nothing new in history. Rome did the same thing when it blamed barbarian peoples for threats to its borders. The difference is that, in the 21st century, battles are fought not only with weapons, but with narratives. Trump mastered this art. He knew that, by accusing others, he diverted attention from the system's own weaknesses. And, while the media debated who was to blame, the wheels of power continued to turn silently. Strategy or smokescreen? When the fight against drugs hides other intentions. Behind every fiery war on drugs speech, there's a question rarely asked. What's really being protected? Trump knew how to use the political stage like no other. And while the headlines talked about cocaine, borders, and cartels, attentive eyes saw something else happening. Agreements, contracts, and strategic repositioning on the global map. Fighting drug trafficking was the perfect pretext, because who would dare question such a seemingly noble cause? At times, operations billed as defensive seemed more focused on controlling trade routes and zones of influence than on eliminating trafficking itself. Political analysts realized that while the spotlight was on the moral fight against drugs, economic and military decisions were advancing almost unnoticed. It's a classic illusionist's trick. While everyone watches one hand, the other executes the real movement. History shows that the rhetoric of fighting evil is one of the oldest tools of power. When used cleverly, it masks deeper intentions beneath a veneer of virtue. Trump, as a strategist, understood that the war on drugs could be the ideal backdrop for global repositioning maneuvers, political, economic, and military. And the more the public believed in the cause, the easier it was to manipulate the plot. But the real smokescreen was still far from dissipating. Between tanks and treaties, the geopolitical impact of Trump's decisions. When the first operations under the banner of fighting drug trafficking began to cross borders, the world realized that it wasn't just about containing drugs, but about redrawing the map of power. Trump knew that every military move carried diplomatic weight, and he used this like a skilled chess player, advancing pieces with his sights set on larger objectives. Every treaty, every alliance, every veiled threat served to reposition the United States as the nerve center of global decision-making. Latin American countries in particular felt the impact. Economic sanctions, political pressure, and veiled threats of military intervention became part of the new diplomatic vocabulary. Meanwhile, nations like China and Russia watched closely, seizing the gaps left by the tension to strengthen their own influence in the region. What seemed like a simple anti-drug offensive quickly turned into a minefield of disputes over hegemony and strategic resources. And so, Trump's moral discourse reverberated beyond American borders. He achieved something rare, converting a domestic narrative into a tool of global domination. The rhetoric of fighting evil became a free pass for tough negotiations, economic impositions, and displays of force. It was as if tanks served as treaty signatures, a way of telling the world that power still spoke English. But true dominance wasn't limited to the military. The real battlefield, media, public opinion, and narrative control. In the 21st century, war isn't fought with weapons alone. It's fought with words, images, and headlines. Trump understood this early. He knew that power lies not only with those who make decisions, but also with those who control what people believe about those decisions. The media became his foxhole, and, at the same time, his megaphone. Every accusation, every inflammatory speech, every carefully calculated social media post was part of a larger strategy: to dominate the narrative before the truth had time to defend itself. When he accused countries of facilitating trafficking or threatened to send troops, the real impact wasn't on the military front, but on screen. With each statement, the market reacted, opinions were divided, and the world revolved around him. He had transformed public opinion into a political weapon, and communication into a battlefield. This ability to manipulate perceptions, to create custom-made enemies and heroes, is what set Trump apart from traditional leaders. He didn't need to win physical battles, he just needed to win the narrative. The strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. While critics were trying to respond to one accusation, he had already launched 10 new ones. It was calculated chaos, an information overload that confused, distracted, and shaped collective opinion. In this game, whoever sets the pace, sets the story. And Trump, with his sharp rhetoric and social media dominance, made communication his primary weapon of power. But the most intriguing thing is that, even after leaving office, the echoes of this narrative war still resonate in the corridors of power. The echo of power, what it reveals about the future of global politics. Even after leaving the White House, the shadow of Trump's strategies continues to loom over the world stage. His style of governing, based on spectacle, provocation, and narrative control, set a dangerous precedent. It demonstrated that, in times of hyperconnectivity, power no longer needs to be won through diplomacy, but through attention. He understood that whoever dominates the masses' gaze dominates the game, and this model began to inspire new leaders who recognized the political value of controlled chaos. The curious thing is that, behind the appearance of impulsiveness, there was calculation. Every controversy, every seemingly ill-timed statement, served to test the limits of public tolerance and shape the global agenda. Countries began to realize that the new form of power is not sustained solely by armies, but by digital influence, psychological manipulation, and informational dominance. Modern war is waged silently, online, behind the scenes, and through perceptions. And Trump was one of the first to understand this with surgical clarity. The result is a more cynical, polarized world, and one more attentive to the behind-the-scenes nature of political discourse. The boundaries between truth and narrative have blurred, and power is now measured in clicks, not treaties. It's a new kind of empire, less territorial, more mental. And the most striking thing is that, even without armies on the march, this form of dominance continues to grow. The question remains, if power now feeds on attention, who's really in charge? Ultimately, what Trump's actions teach us is that power is rarely achieved by force. It is constructed by narrative. Drug trafficking was merely the pretext, the stage for a much larger struggle: control over people's beliefs. And this is where reflection needs to begin. How many times have you believed in a noble cause that, deep down, served hidden interests? How many times has fear been used to manipulate your perception of what is right and just? Global politics today is a spectacle of shadows and lights, and those who don't learn to read the behind-the-scenes become part of the audience, not part of the game. True power lies in seeing what's unsaid, questioning official versions, and understanding that every war begins with a well-told story. You can choose to be manipulated, or learn to decipher the plot. Because in the end, the most dangerous enemy is never the one on the outside. It's the one that dominates your attention. Now I ask you, what do you believe to be true? And who taught you to believe it? If this content made you think differently, if it opened your eyes to the power behind words, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, each video is an invitation to see the world without the lens of manipulation and understand the game that shapes the destiny of nations.